They say that certain files from the winter of 1893 carry a silence that no witness has been able to fully explain. Before we begin, the researcher who organized this account discreetly invites viewers to comment on which city they are watching from and what time it is now. Valuable information for those who study how these stories transcend time. In the aged records of Mendocino County, near the cold forests of Northern California, lies the case of sisters Eveline and Marjorie Redwood, known to locals as the Redwood Sisters, an informal title that matched the immense row of trees surrounding the family property. In 1893, when they disappeared without leaving satisfactory answers, Eveline was 32 and Marjorie was 36. They lived in an isolated wooden house, built on a small hill that faced the biting winds of the Pacific and the dense shadows of the forest. The winter of that year had been particularly harsh, and travelers' notes mention the landscape as a gray, motionless expanse, where even the air seemed to doubt whether it should continue. The two women were descendants of settlers who had settled there decades earlier. The Redwood family was not particularly prominent, but they had a reputation for honesty, hard work, and an emotional reserve that, although common at the time, seemed even more pronounced in their case. The sisters' mother had died when they were in their early 20s, and their father, Lenford Redwood, had survived a few more winters before succumbing to a sudden fever. Since then, Eveline and Marjorie had lived alone on the property, managing small crops, trading supplies with distant neighbors, and repairing what could be repaired before the harshest winds arrived. Accounts from the period describe Eveline as the more practical and quiet of the two. She was seen a few times a year at the small markets in the valley, always with short lists and brief but polite responses. Marjorie, on the other hand, showed greater sensitivity, jotting down thoughts, observations about the weather, and seasonal routines in a notebook that would later be found among the family's belongings. Although discreet, they were known enough that their disappearance caused immediate astonishment. The community around Redwood, made up of loggers, small farmers, widows, merchants and travelers who came and went in search of opportunities, respected the sisters' voluntary distance. Many attributed this behavior to the difficulties of remote living, others to the reserved personality they had inherited from their father, but everyone agreed on one thing. Despite their isolation, Eveline and Marjorie were organized, disciplined, and showed no signs of unusual vulnerability. There was no indication that a breakdown, sudden escape, or internal conflict could arise there. The setting that envelops this story is one of the wildest on the West Coast in the 19th century. The wind, as it hit the towering trunks of the redwoods, produced a hollow, almost continuous sound that the locals called the breath of the mountains. During the winter, this sound became slower, drawn out, as if coming from far away. The sisters' house, with its narrow chimney and east-facing attic, seemed to rest among these natural voices, and it is precisely in this attic, referred to in reports as the winter attic, that the first point of strangeness in the official records would arise. In January 1893, a local hunter named Silas Morton claimed to have seen unusual smoke coming from the Redwood family's chimney. This would not have been cause for concern had it not been for the fact that Eveline and Marjorie had said weeks earlier that they intended to spend part of the season at a relative's house further south. Silas's observation, initially ignored, would gain importance only days later, when other men in the region reported metallic noises coming from the property, noises that, according to them, did not match known domestic activities. These details became even more enigmatic when, upon revisiting testimonies and letters, the researcher responsible for reconstructing this narrative came across a marginal note made by a local police chief in 1894. There are inconsistencies in the reports about the Redwood attic, conflicting information about objects stored there and about who had gone up there last winter. The strangeness does not end there. In a letter written by Marjorie weeks before her disappearance, there is a sentence that has intrigued historians. "Winter watches us." The context is unclear, and no continuation explaining the intention of this sentence has been found. The most disturbing point, however, appears in another document, a report stating that 36 hunters from the region, men accustomed to trails, snowstorms, and the dangers of the forest, approached the sisters' house during a spontaneous search that same winter after rumors that the two had not traveled anywhere. The report ends with a laconic comment. None of them returned with conclusive information. And so, by combining fragmented testimonies, personal letters, official reports, and rumors passed down orally for decades, the first layer of the mystery surrounding Eveline and Marjorie Redwood is formed. The oldest record mentioning all these facts ends with a simple but disturbing sentence. Everything we know begins and ends in the winter attic. Before their disappearance, the Redwood sisters led a life that, in the eyes of the region's inhabitants, seemed carefully constructed on simple routines, repeated with almost ritualistic precision. The property, inherited from their father, had remained virtually unchanged since the 1870s. A narrow, thick-timbered house supported by beams that could withstand the harshest winters. A small, low-ceilinged barn where they stored tools, dried corn, and stacked firewood. And, at the back, an irregular clearing where they tried to grow the bare minimum needed for the following year. Nothing there attracted attention, except for the east-facing attic used by the sisters during the coldest months, when the wind made it impossible to stay outdoors for long periods of time. Records from travelers who passed through the area in early 1893 describe Eveline and Marjorie as calm women, busy with tasks that required more discipline than strength. Eveline did most of the structural repairs and dealt with the few hunters who from time to time traded game meat for groceries. Marjorie, on the other hand, devoted herself to writing, keeping detailed notes on the weather and taking care of the house, always maintaining a curious visual order. Every object had its exact place, and any slight misalignment seemed to bother her deeply. In the weeks leading up to their disappearance, however, there are indications that small cracks began to appear in the two women's routine. In a 1902 testimony, former merchant Abram Lowett recalls that Eveline, always discreet, had made an unusual visit to his store a few days before the turn of the year. She didn't buy anything. She just asked if anyone in the area was planning long trips that winter. The merchant replied that he knew of nothing, and Eveline nodded briefly before leaving without offering an explanation. This account, though simple, appears in two official documents, reinforcing the impression that something was troubling the younger sister. The neighborhood, made up of families scattered over long distances, also noticed that the lights in the Redwood house remained on longer than usual. These were not candles, but oil lamps, visible from a distance when the fog cleared. A woodcutter named Thomas Redwill reported observing constant movement on the upper floor, something unusual for women who, according to him, preferred to retire early. Thomas's wife confirmed this observation, adding that Eveline and Marjorie seemed to avoid visits even from old acquaintances. The relationship between the two sisters, although affectionate, was not without tension. A lost diary, attributed to Marjorie and partially recovered in the 1910s, contains brief but significant passages, small notes about subtle arguments, silent disagreements, and annoyances that were never fully expressed. Nothing serious, it seems, but enough to suggest that that winter required closer coexistence than either of them was accustomed to. On stormy days when the winds made the walls shake, it was common for them to stay in the attic, embroidering, writing, mending fabrics, or just waiting for the cold to subside. Local residents describe Eveline as someone endowed with a kind of solid resignation, a quiet strength that allowed her to make practical decisions in difficult times. Marjorie, on the other hand, was known for her sensitivity, her restless observations about her surroundings, and an emotional exhaustion that seemed to increase in the darker months. In a letter written to a distant cousin, she describes that winter as heavier than previous ones, as if it had arrived early and had no intention of leaving any time soon. There are no further details, but the fragment suggests that Marjorie perceived the weather, and perhaps something else, as a growing weight on the house. Workers passing by the trail to the east claimed to have heard conversations coming from inside the property at unlikely times. Not arguments, but brief, quick dialogues, often ending abruptly, as if something had interrupted the conversation. Most of these reports were dismissed in the initial official investigation, but reappeared in later testimony, indicating that the sisters were more agitated than usual. At local markets, Eveline was always seen in silence, analyzing prices and avoiding prolonged conversations. But in the last month before her disappearance, she had let slip a few comments about the unpredictable weather and the increasing difficulty of keeping the house warm. A Mexican traveler who had been in the area for a few days reported that Marjorie seemed particularly restless, pacing back and forth while Eveline negotiated simple exchanges. He described a look as if she were hearing something that others did not hear. Although poetic, the account was included in later files because of its strange consistency with other testimonies. Still, none of these signs seemed sufficient to prepare the community for what was to come. The Redwoods, though reserved, were predictable and disciplined, and there was no history that would justify outside intervention. The region, marked by long winters and involuntary isolation, had already seen dozens of families dealing with the cold and loneliness without major incidents. What few knew was that particular winter, Eveline had reinforced the attic locks and reorganized old objects, including boxes belonging to her father. There are records that mention the abnormal movement of heavy items during the night, as well as notes by Marjorie that mention sounds coming from above, which at the time were interpreted vaguely and never thoroughly investigated. The Redwood home thus remained a microcosm of silent routines, small signs of tension, and subtle movements that would only make sense when pieced together years later. With each document found, each belated testimony, the impression grows that Eveline and Marjorie were trying to maintain normality, even as something was slowly shifting toward the irreversible, and the last known witness to see them alive adds the most disturbing detail of this period prior to their disappearance. They seemed ready for winter, but somehow it also seemed that winter was ready for them. The records dealing with the night of the Redwood sisters' disappearance are fragmented, incomplete, and sometimes contradictory. Still, when lined up in chronological order, they reveal a sequence of events that, although seemingly scattered, make up the last known glimpse of what might have happened on the property that harsh winter of 1893. Reconstructing this stretch requires attention to the climate, distances, and way of life at the time, because the narrative gaps are themselves part of the mystery. The snowstorm that hit northern Mendocino between January 11 and 13 was described as one of the quietest in 2 decades. The wind, usually merciless, gave way to a heavy, almost motionless calm. Dense flakes fell vertically, unhurriedly, accumulating in thick layers that absorbed all kinds of noise. One witness, after visiting the region days later, said that even the animals seemed to have stopped breathing. The trail leading to the sisters' house disappeared under the weight of the snow, making the walk there an arduous task, even for the most experienced. On the night of January 12th, around 8 o'clock, woodcutter Thomas Redwill reported seeing an unusual light in the attic of the Redwood house. It was not the usual lamp, whose yellowish color he had known for years. According to him, the light seemed stronger, more unstable, as if it were fueled by an unusual type of fuel, or was constantly being moved from side to side. Thomas's wife, upon hearing the report years later, confirmed that she had seen him restless that night, staring intently in the direction of the property while the snow fell heavily. Records indicate that Eveline and Marjorie were inside the house at that time. In one of the rare written statements from someone who knew them, a distant neighbor, Clara Whitmore, said she had spoken with Eveline 2 days earlier, when she was still planning to reinforce parts of the roof. Eveline mentioned that the attic needed to be reorganized before a new shipment of firewood arrived, an important detail, as it indicates that they really intended to occupy the attic for long periods during the winter. At 9:30 that same night, 3 hunters returning from an area near the river heard what they described as a hollow sound coming from the east, like wood creaking under weight. At first, they thought it was just the roof of some distant cabin, crushed by accumulated snow. However, upon arriving in the village the next day, They reported that the sound had seemed prolonged, almost as if something were dragging a heavy beam or box across the floor. This detail would later become relevant, as records indicate that the Redwood family's attic housed the father's old boxes, some described as large enough to require 2 adults to move. Around 10:30 a.m., a lone traveler, identified in documents as Henry Liscombe, crossed the trail connecting the valley to the main road heading south. He claimed to have seen smoke coming out of the Redwood house's chimney, something that, although common, contradicted the statement released weeks earlier that the sisters would be traveling. Liscombe also noticed a shadow passing in front of the upstairs window. In his words, "I can't say if it was Eveline or Marjorie. The snow distorted the shapes, but there was someone there, moving from side to side." No other witnesses reported any movement at that time. What is known, however, is that between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., the snowstorm intensified abruptly, reducing visibility to a few meters. The few men still walking in the area sought makeshift shelter in tents or woodsheds. The Redwood house remained hidden under a thick veil of snow and darkness. The last confirmed clue about the sisters' presence that night comes from an object found decades later, a small piece of blue-gray fabric, consistent with the type of wool used by residents at the time, especially in winter dresses. It was discovered on the outside of the attic window, attached to a worn wooden splinter. Analysis carried out in 1911 concluded that the fabric had not been torn off abruptly, but by repeated friction against the wood, suggesting that someone had leaned or rested against that part of the structure. At 2:30 in the morning, the wind returned, this time violent, pushing the century-old trees as if they were flexible columns. With this sudden return of the wind, the most disconcerting part of the reconstruction emerges, the account of the 36 hunters. Although the story is often treated as folkloric exaggeration, some of the names mentioned appear in official regional search documents. They reportedly approached the house that early morning, guided by growing concern and a feeling, shared by many, that something unusual was happening there. According to preserved documents, the hunters divided into smaller groups and walked silently through the deep snow. The footprints they left on the ground were recorded days later by local police officers. There is no mention of confrontation, struggle, or signs of outside presence. The trail simply ends a few meters from the house, as if, from that point on, the snowstorm had erased all traces of human movement. The most intriguing point arises when the official report mentions the absence of footprints leaving the house that night. There were marks that suggested an approach, but none that indicated a departure. The initial conclusion was that Eveline and Marjorie remained inside until dawn. However, when the search team returned days later, the house was empty and the attic was intact, but with one detail that still causes discomfort among researchers: a slight circular mark on the floor, as if a heavy object had been dragged from there to the inner door. The climax of this documentary reconstruction comes when 3 different sources are cross-referenced. The first is Thomas Redwill's testimony, stating that the light in the attic went out abruptly around 3:40 a.m. The second is a note by Marjorie found in her notebook, dated 2 days earlier: "If necessary, we will only move what winter allows." The third is a record written by Deputy Lawson while examining the empty house. The feeling was that someone had left in a hurry, but the snow said otherwise. And it is precisely the combination of these contrasts, movement and immobility, light and sudden darkness, approach and absence of exit, that makes the last piece of confirmed evidence so disturbing. A deep mark in the wood of the attic, indicating that something had been placed there or removed from there moments before the Redwood sisters' final disappearance. When the winter of 1893 began to recede and the trails reappeared under the thaw, local authorities were finally able to reach the Redwood sisters' property. The scene they found there offered no immediate drama or obvious signs of violence. On the contrary, everything was indecently quiet, as if the house had been abandoned with extreme care. This contrast between absence and order was, for many, the first sign that something was more disturbing than the news of the disappearance itself. Deputy Lawson, responsible for coordinating the search, described in his report that the house seemed to hold the air as if it had remained closed for weeks without allowing wind or light to circulate. The utensils were in place, the firewood stored as usual, the table set with only 2 glasses and an empty jug. There were no signs of a recent meal, nor of haste. It was as if Eveline and Marjorie had interrupted their routine between one gesture and another, and never resumed it. The community, upon receiving the news of the confirmed disappearance, reacted in a restrained manner. Families in that region were accustomed to sudden losses caused by illness, storms, and accidents in the woods. Still, there was something different about the Redwood sisters. They were known, albeit distantly, and represented the idea of permanence in a place where almost everything changed over time. Their absence, therefore, created a kind of collective void, a silent question that hung over brief conversations and avoided glances. The first official stage of the investigation focused on the house. Deputies examined the attic floor, where they found the aforementioned circular mark, deep, rounded, indicating that a heavy object had been dragged from there to the interior door. There were no signs of breakage, and the surrounding wood showed old, not recent wear, which further confused investigators. The question that arose was simple but decisive. What was up there that required force to move? Documents from the 1870s suggest that Lenford Redwood, the sisters' father, kept boxes of tools, seeds, and emergency supplies in the attic. But none of these would have been missing in 1893. Everything remained in place, except for a single object that no one could identify. In addition to the circular mark, there was the detail of the fabric found stuck to the wood. The authorities preserved the fragment, and although there was no technology to accurately confirm its origin, the fabric matched one of Marjorie's winter dresses. This trace, modest but insistent, rekindled debates about what could have taken her to the attic window in the middle of the night. The 36 hunters who allegedly approached the house were, for months, the most controversial point of the investigation. Some residents believed the number was exaggerated. Others insisted that all the names mentioned existed and were in the area that night. Detective Lawson found only 10 of them for formal statements. The rest had moved away, died, or simply refused to talk about the matter. Those who agreed to testify were unanimous on one detail. We saw light in the attic, then it went out, and then everything was the same. We didn't hear anything. This collective silence has been interpreted in 2 ways over the years. For some, it indicated that nothing unusual had happened, and that the sisters could have run away, had an accident, or gotten lost during the snowstorm. For others, the silence only revealed the discomfort of experienced men who preferred not to admit the strange feeling they had experienced that early morning. The official investigation, however, found no solid evidence that the sisters had left the house on their own. In statements taken weeks after the thaw, some neighbors reported finding small prints in the snow around the property, but all were distorted and impossible to identify. The distances between these marks were also irregular, suggesting that they could have been made by animals, wind, or even the first search teams. Nothing conclusive was gleaned from this. The emotional reaction of the community, although discreet, became more visible in the following weeks. Women left small pieces of fabric sewn at the trailhead as a gesture of respect. Woodcutters who used to trade goods with the sisters stopped passing through the area for a while. Even the merchants in the village, when commenting briefly on the case, spoke in a tone that seemed to mix sadness, relief, and resignation, as if they recognized that certain questions, at that time, would simply not be answered. The revelation that most influenced the modern understanding of the case came not during the 1893 investigations, but in documents revisited 4 decades later. Comparing statements and letters, a historian noted that Eveline had made unusual visits to the barn in the days before her disappearance, reorganizing tools and reinforcing parts of the internal structure. Marjorie, according to her notebook, had repeatedly written down expressions about preparing the high and following the rhythm of winter. The most widely accepted interpretation among contemporary researchers is that the sisters, each in their own way, were preparing for something, not necessarily an external event, but perhaps an internal change in routine. such as stocking up on supplies or reorganizing the house to cope with a harsher winter. The most striking consequence of this interpretation is also the most painful. It is possible that Eveline and Marjorie tried to deal alone with a situation that required help, and that their historic refusal to ask for assistance increased the risks that particular winter. This hypothesis, human, plausible, and deeply sad, has become the most widely accepted among the few scholars who still analyze the case. It does not solve the mystery, but it does provide an emotionally understandable conclusion. The Redwood sisters, so accustomed to autonomy, may have been overcome by the cumulative weight of isolation, inclement weather, and a winter longer than previous ones. The last relevant note found in the archives is a brief sentence written by Sheriff Lawson months after closing the case. Sometimes absence is the only faithful witness, and it is from this absence, delicate, insistent, impossible to fill, that the final revelation of the case emerges. The Redwood sisters probably did not disappear abruptly, but gradually succumbed to the winter, the isolation, and the silence that shaped every corner of that house. Decades have passed since the Redwood sisters' names last appeared in local newspapers. Today, the files surrounding their story rest in darkened wooden drawers, stored in small municipal libraries, accessed only by occasional researchers, curious students, or residents who wish to revisit a past that insists on remaining incomplete. When handling these documents, one always gets the same feeling. The story seems to want to be told, but remains uncomfortably scattered, like old snow that melts at the touch. No significant new evidence has emerged since the early 20th century. Marjorie's notes, the fabric found in the window, the marks in the attic, the hunter's testimonies, everything has been examined, reinterpreted, archived, and forgotten in a kind of silent cycle that characterizes cases that never reached a definitive conclusion. Many of the names involved no longer exist in the living memory of the region. The forests have changed, the trails have changed, but the absence remains a fixed point, stuck in the time of 1893. For historians who are still interested in the case, what stands out is not the lack of clues, but the humanity that overflows from the small gaps. The sisters' silence, so characteristic, becomes even more revealing when viewed from a distance. It does not suggest secrecy, but resistance. It does not suggest a fabricated mystery, but the desire to preserve, as far as possible, a life that obeyed particular rhythms shaped by loneliness, by the identity of that land, and by the memory of a father who had taught them to face winter with dignity. When reading Marjorie's diary, even in fragments, one senses her attempt to understand the world around her through words. Her writing is firm, direct, but charged with an almost painful perception of the seasons. Eveline, on the other hand, remains in the archives as a difficult portrait to decipher. Practical, reserved, efficient, almost always seen in motion, taking care of something, reinforcing something, keeping the house alive. It is this discreet complementarity that makes her disappearance so deeply unsettling. There are no antagonists, no explicit conflicts, just two women trying to survive a harsh winter, like so many before and after them. Over the years, scholars have attempted to reconstruct what might have happened on that particular dawn. Some theorize that the sisters faced an invisible structural collapse of the house, perhaps aggravated by the weight of snow. Others believe that Marjorie, already emotionally drained, felt overwhelmed, and Eveline, faithful to her family responsibility, tried to help her in extreme conditions. There are even those who suggest that the presence of the hunters, although motivated by concern, came too late to prevent the inevitable. None of these scenarios is entirely satisfactory, but they all carry the same essence. The Redwood sisters did not disappear because of mystery, but because of humanity. Looking at the archives, it is clear that what remains are not material traces, but emotional impressions. The house, already ravaged by time, was dismantled a decade and a half after the disappearance. The barn, destroyed by successive storms, left only fragments of wood, now covered by foliage. The attic, which raised so many questions, no longer exists, and perhaps that is for the best. What remains are reports, scattered phrases, reconstructed memories, and a final line written by a police chief who, despite being pragmatic, understood that certain stories offer no conclusions. If what we seek is certainty, we will not find it here. The epilogue to this case, however, is not in the documents, but in the effect it has on those who revisit it. The story of the Redwood sisters has become a kind of silent mirror. The more one looks at the absence, the more one realizes that it speaks of presence. The more one tries to fill in the gaps, the more they reveal that deep down they never wanted to be filled in. Perhaps Eveline and Marjorie lived and disappeared in the only way that suited their routines, together, discreet, proud, going through a winter that gave them no room to hesitate. Walking along the trails of Mendocino today, there are those who claim that nothing betrays the fact that two lives disappeared there. The forest has recovered, the wind has resumed its rhythm, and the redwoods continue to grow with the same silent grandeur as always. However, for those who know the story, there is something almost imperceptible in the landscape, not a sign, not a trace, but a kind of involuntary respect that emerges when remembering that an ordinary life, even without witnesses, leaves marks that time tries to erase but never completely succeeds. And so, in closing this account, the researcher who organized these pages recognizes that absence should not be treated as a failure, but as a form of memory. There are stories that survive precisely because they cannot be explained, and perhaps that is why the Redwood sisters still accompany us, not as tragic figures, but as presences that time has not been able to dissolve entirely. The case remains open only in the consciousness of those who revisit it, for in the archives there is only silence, and it is in this silence that the story ends.